Darcey Silva has built her entire brand on one single, unshakable thing: love. Finding it, deserving it, chasing it across airports and time zones and language barriers, through men with questionable intentions and even more questionable visa situations. The dream of a real family, an expanded one, a chosen one. That dream has been the emotional engine of everything she has ever shown us. So when the internet, armed with screenshots and timestamps and the kind of forensic dedication usually reserved for cold case documentaries, started pulling on one very specific thread connected to that dream, what unraveled was something none of us were fully prepared for. This is not a rumor. This is not a fan theory. This is a documented, sourced, independently verified timeline contradiction that has now been seen by hundreds of thousands of people. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Stay with me, because this is where it gets real. If this kind of deep dive content is what you're here for, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the Tell All Tapes. We go where the receipts go. Always. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning matters more than people realize. Darcey Silva did not arrive on our screens as a villain. She arrived as something far more sympathetic and far more complicated than that. She arrived as a woman who wanted, desperately and visibly, to be loved. And that raw, almost painful transparency about her longing is what made her compelling television. You could not look away from her, not because she was making bad decisions, though she often was, but because the feeling underneath every bad decision was so recognizable. She wanted what most people want. She just wanted it louder and on camera and across international borders with men who were, to put it gently, not always operating in full transparency themselves. That context matters. That context is everything, because you cannot understand what is now being alleged about her without understanding the emotional architecture of who Darcey Silva is and how she has always operated. She has never been someone who lives primarily in fact. She lives in feelings. She lives in the story she is telling herself about where she is and where she is going and what she deserves. And for a long time, that quality made her one of the most watchable people in the entire 90-day franchise universe. The vulnerability was real even when the circumstances around it were complicated. So now we get to the part that the internet cannot let go of. And I want to walk through this carefully because the details are specific, and the details are what make this different from the usual gossip cycle that surrounds anyone in this franchise. Somewhere in the timeline of Darcey's very public life, a life she has documented extensively across multiple social platforms with an almost compulsive frequency, something does not add up. And I do not say that lightly. I say it because multiple independent accounts, working separately and arriving at the same conclusions, have now compiled and cross-referenced enough documentation to produce what can only be described as a factual problem. Not a feeling, not a vibe. A factual, mathematical, biological problem. Here is what we know happened on the internet side of this story. A deep dive account on a major social platform published an analysis. Not a quick post, not a caption. An actual structured, sourced, slide-by-slide breakdown, 47 slides that compared posts Darcey made during a specific and very significant period against posts from her sister Stacey, against known location data, against appearance-based documentation pulled from multiple platforms across the same window of time. 47 slides, fully timestamped, publicly sourced. That post was shared over 180,000 times, and the comment section was not full of gossip. It was full of people, including people identifying themselves as medical professionals, engaging with the specific biological questions the analysis raised. That is not a rumor mill. That is a community doing investigative work with receipts attached. Now, what exactly did those receipts reveal? This is where we have to talk about biology, because biology is the part of this story that does not negotiate. Pregnancy has a timeline. It has math. It has a set of physical realities that progress in a documented, medically understood sequence that does not bend for filming schedules or network notes or the emotional reality that someone very much wants something to be true. The body does not care about your narrative arc. The body operates on its own clock. What the fan analysis identified and what multiple people working independently confirmed was a gap, a specific window of several weeks where what was being stated publicly and what was being documented physically across Darcey's own posts, her sister's posts, and location tagged content from people around her during that period do not align in a way that medical professionals, including those commenting publicly on the analysis, describe as compatible. Two realities that cannot both be true at the same time. That is the core of what is being alleged, and the specificity of it is what has kept this from fading the way most internet drama fades. Because here's the thing about the modern reality television ecosystem that most casual viewers do not fully appreciate. Nothing is ever actually deleted. It is only moved. When you delete a post in 2024, what you have actually done is transferred that post from your control to someone else's archive. There are entire accounts, entire communities of people whose primary activity is the preservation of content posted and then removed by public figures. Screenshots, timestamps, location tags, tagged appearances in other people's content, all of it gets cataloged. And in this particular case, the things that were quietly removed from Darcey's platforms during the relevant period were not removed quickly enough. The archive accounts had already done their work. The folders were already full. And then someone opened those folders and put the contents into a 47-slide presentation, and the internet lost its mind. Let's talk about why this specific allegation carries a different kind of weight than the usual drama that follows anyone in the 90-day universe. Because there is a long tradition in this franchise of exaggeration, of selective truth-telling, of presenting a version of events that is technically accurate from one angle while being deeply misleading from every other angle. That is not a Darcey-specific critique. That is a franchise-wide condition. Everyone on this show, to varying degrees, constructs a narrative. That is what the show is. That is what the producers want. That is what the audience rewards. But pregnancy is different. Pregnancy is not a narrative that can be constructed in the traditional sense, because pregnancy is biological. And when you bring pregnancy into the story, when you make it part of your public identity, when you post about it, when you reference it in ways that affect how your audience relates to you, you are making a claim that has a specific, verifiable, medically bounded truth. You either are or you are not. The weeks either passed in the way that biology requires, or they did not. There is no soft editing of that particular reality, and the professional stakes attached to that reality are significant in ways that go beyond the personal. This is the part that people who are not inside the reality television industry sometimes miss. Pregnancy in this ecosystem is monetized. It generates storylines that networks pay for. It generates a particular kind of audience investment, protective, emotionally intense, long-term, that is genuinely valuable from a production standpoint. It affects contract negotiations in ways that are not always visible to the viewer. A pregnant cast member is a different kind of asset to a network than a cast member who is not pregnant. The storyline value, the audience sympathy, the sense of personal stakes, all of it increases. And then there are brand partnerships. Because certain brands specifically seek out pregnant or recently pregnant public figures for exactly the kind of warm, aspirational, family-oriented content that converts to sales. If your pregnancy is documented and public and ongoing, you become eligible for a category of paid partnership that you would not otherwise qualify for. The financial incentive to have that storyline be real or to present it as real is not small. It is measurable. It is the kind of incentive that, when you are weighing it against a desire that feels enormous and a dream that you have publicly declared more times than anyone can count, might feel like justification for something. I am not saying that justification happened. I am saying the incentive existed, and the internet has noticed that the incentive exists. Now let's do the character analysis, because this is where I want to be genuinely fair and genuinely honest at the same time. Darcey's relationship with the story she tells about herself has always been complicated, and I want to be clear that is not an insult. That is an observation rooted in years of watching her operate in public. She has always been someone who inhabits the emotional reality of something before, and sometimes instead of the factual reality of it. She felt the relationship was working before the evidence supported that it was working. She spoke about the business as thriving at times when the external evidence was more complicated than that. She has always led with feeling. Always. That quality is part of what makes her so watchable and so sympathetic and so genuinely human in a franchise that sometimes produces people who feel more like characters than people. Her emotions are real. The intensity of what she feels about love, about family, about her place in the world and the story she is living is not performed. That part of Darcey has always been completely authentic. The question the internet is now asking is whether that same instinct to feel the truth of something before it is technically true, to inhabit a version of events that is emotionally real even when the facts have not yet caught up, whether that instinct extended to the chapter of her life that carries the highest possible emotional weight. The question is not whether Darcey is a liar in the way that word is usually meant. The question is whether someone who lives so completely in the feeling of things rather than the facts of them could have, at a moment of enormous personal significance, allowed the feeling to generate a story that the biology cannot fully support. That is a very specific and very human kind of thing to potentially do. And it is also a very specific and very serious kind of thing to allege, which is why the way any response to this plays out matters enormously. Because here is what I want you to watch for, and this is important. Any response to allegations of this nature, any response at all, is going to involve grief. It almost has to. Because grief is the emotional register that most effectively silences critics. You cannot push back hard against someone who is visibly in pain without appearing monstrous. Grief functions as a kind of protective field in the court of public opinion. And anyone who has watched enough reality television drama knows this intuitively, even if they have never articulated it. But grief and an answer are not the same thing. Pain and an explanation are not the same thing. And an audience that loves you and an audience that believes you are not automatically the same audience. Those three things, grief, explanation, and credibility, are about to be tested simultaneously. And the question is, which one arrives first, and whether it addresses the actual specific documented questions that the 47 slide analysis raised. Because those questions are specific. They are not emotional, they are not interpretive, they are mathematical and biological and timestamp based. And an emotional response, no matter how genuine, no matter how painful, does not answer a mathematical question. The math either works or it does not. The timeline either holds or it does not. And the audience that compiled those slides is not going to be satisfied by tears in the absence of evidence. Now, here is the layer of this that I find genuinely heartbreaking to think about, separate from all the internet drama and the receipts and the slide presentations. Who does Darcey Silva talk to when something like this becomes the story? Let's think about that for a second. Stacey is her sister, her mirror, her closest person on earth. And Stacey is also the last person in the world who is going to ask Darcey a hard question. Their relationship is built on mutual reinforcement, on showing up for each other, on presenting a unified front to a world that has not always been kind to either of them. Stacey is not the person who challenges Darcey. Stacey is the person who stands next to Darcey. Those are two very different roles. Her daughters should be nowhere near this conversation. Full stop. They are her children, not her advisors, and any situation in which they are expected to process or validate something this complicated on her behalf is a situation that has already gone wrong in a significant way. The men from her past, and there are several, have their own complicated and public histories with honesty and transparency and the relationship between what they said and what was true. They are not the reference point for truth-telling in Darcey's world. Her fan base, as of right now, is divided down the middle between fierce and vocal defenders who will support her regardless of what the timeline shows, and people who are actively building and sharing the documentation. Neither of those groups is capable of giving her what she actually needs in this moment, which is one honest person who loves her enough to ask the real questions. And that is the saddest part of this whole situation. Not the allegations, not the receipts, not the 47 slides. The saddest part is the possibility that at the moment when the truth, whatever it is, matters most, Darcey Silva may be surrounded entirely by people who either love her too much to challenge her or are too busy challenging her to love her. And neither of those is the thing that actually helps. She needs one honest person. One person who can sit across from her without an agenda, without a brand deal, without a camera, and ask the question directly and wait for an actual answer. And based on everything we have watched over the years of her being a public figure, I genuinely do not know if she has that person in her life. And that matters, not just for this situation, but for every situation that comes after it. So let's talk about what silence actually communicates in the age we are living in. Because there is an assumption that many public figures still operate under an assumption that was maybe accurate 15 years ago, which is that if you do not respond to something, it will eventually go away. That the news cycle will move, that a new drama will emerge, that the audience will get distracted and redirect their attention to the next thing, and the unanswered question will quietly dissolve into the background noise of the internet and stop mattering to anyone. That assumption is no longer correct, and it has not been corrected for a long time. But it is especially catastrophically incorrect in a world where fan communities are organized, where archive accounts exist specifically to prevent the deletion of evidence, where cross-platform analysis is a hobby that people pursue with genuine skill and genuine dedication, and where a 47-slide presentation can be shared 180,000 times in a window of days. In that world, silence is not neutral. Silence is a data point, and the internet reads it accordingly. Every day that passes without a specific, evidence-based response to specific, evidence-based questions is a day that the gap between what was claimed and what the documentation shows grows more visible, not less. The audience is not forgetting. The audience is watching the clock. And the people who built those slides are not going anywhere. They are, if anything, looking for the next thing to add to the folder. Here is what I want to be completely transparent about, because I think this channel owes its audience honesty above everything else. I do not know what the truth of this situation is. I want to say that directly and clearly and without any of the hedging that can make that kind of statement feel like a legal disclaimer rather than a genuine position. I am not inside Darcey Silva's life. I do not have access to her medical records or her private communications or the conversations she has had behind closed doors with the people closest to her. What I have is the same thing the rest of the internet has: the public record, the archived posts, the timestamps, the documented physical evidence, and the analysis that has been produced by people who spent significant time compiling it. And what that public record shows is a contradiction that has not been explained. That is not the same as proof of wrongdoing. A contradiction is a contradiction. It means two things do not fit together in the way they should. It means a question has been raised that has not yet been answered. It means the math does not currently work. What it does not mean, and I want to be precise about this, is that we have arrived at a certain conclusion. We have arrived at an unresolved question. And the resolution of that question is now entirely in the hands of one person. But here is the thing about unresolved questions in the reality television universe, and specifically in the 90-day universe, which has a particular and very specific culture around truth and transparency and the relationship between what happened and what was shown. The audience has been trained through years of watching this franchise to understand that the official version of events is rarely the complete version of events. They have been shown repeatedly and explicitly that cast members lie, that producers shape narratives, that what makes it to air is a curated version of something more complicated, that the contracts are constructed in ways that incentivize certain kinds of storytelling and discourage others. The audience of this franchise is not naive. They are, collectively, some of the most media-literate viewers in the reality television space because they have had to become media-literate just to follow the show, which means they are not going to accept a response that treats them as if they are naive. They are not going to accept an emotional deflection as a substitute for an actual explanation. They have been given 47 slides of documentation. They want 47 slides worth of response. And anything less than that is going to be received not as grief or vulnerability or privacy, all of which are legitimate things, but as confirmation that there is no answer available because the answer does not support the story. Now let's zoom out for a moment, because this situation does not exist in isolation. It exists inside a much larger conversation that the internet has been having for the past several years about the relationship between reality television and actual reality. And that conversation has accelerated dramatically as the tools available to audiences have gotten more sophisticated and more accessible. What used to require a production team and a fact checker and a legal department to uncover can now be accomplished by a dedicated fan with a phone and a spreadsheet and too much time on a Thursday night. We are living through a period where the power to investigate has genuinely democratized. And the institutions that used to control the narrative, the networks, the production companies, the publicists, the official channels, have not fully adjusted to that reality. They are still operating in many cases on the assumption that they control what gets seen and what gets remembered. They do not. The audience does. The archive accounts do. The 47 slide presentations do. The 180,000 shares do. And Darcey Silva, whether she fully understands it or not, is navigating this new landscape with tools and instincts that were developed in the old one. She knows how to create an emotional narrative. She knows how to present vulnerability in a way that generates sympathy. She knows how to use platforms to tell the story she wants to tell. What she may not fully reckon with is that the platforms she uses to tell that story are the same platforms that the archive accounts use to preserve the contradictions within it. Every post is simultaneously her storytelling and someone else's evidence. That is the world she lives in. That is the world everyone in her position lives in now. Let's talk about what happens next, because there are really only a handful of ways this can go, and each of them says something significant about who Darcey Silva is and what she values and how she intends to proceed. The first possibility is that she responds directly and specifically to the timeline questions with documentation of her own. Medical records, private posts with genuine timestamps, some form of verifiable evidence that addresses the specific contradiction the fan analysis identified. This is the only response that would genuinely resolve the question. It is also, notably, the response that would require her to operate in a register she has never been entirely comfortable in: the factual, the documented, the provable. It would require her to trust evidence over narrative. And based on everything we know about who Darcey Silva is, that would be a significant departure from her instinctive mode of operation. But it is the only response that fully closes the loop. The second possibility is an emotional response. A tearful video, a heartfelt caption, a conversation with Stacey on camera that addresses the pain of the allegations without engaging with the specific documented contradictions. This is the most predictable response given her history and her instincts. It would generate an enormous wave of support from the portion of her fan base that is not interested in spreadsheets. It would generate sympathy from casual viewers who find the clinical nature of the allegations uncomfortable. And it would do absolutely nothing to satisfy the part of the audience that built those 47 slides. In fact, it would probably make things worse with that segment of viewers, because to them, an emotional response in the absence of factual engagement reads as exactly the kind of deflection they were expecting. The third possibility, and I think in some ways the most revealing one, is continued silence. Not aggressive silence, not a deliberate decision to confront the allegations head-on and refuse to dignify them with a response, just the ordinary silence of someone who does not know how to answer a question that does not have a good answer. The silence of someone who is waiting for the situation to resolve itself, or for a new drama to overtake this one in the public conversation, or for enough time to pass that the question feels less urgent. That silence, if it holds, will be read by the audience not as privacy or dignity, but as confirmation. Because in the post 47 slides world, silence has a meaning, and the meaning is not ambiguous. And then there is the fourth possibility, which is the one I think about most when I think about who Darcey actually is, underneath all the cameras and the storylines and the emotional theater of the last several years. The fourth possibility is that she tells the truth, whatever that truth is, that she finds that one honest person or becomes her own honest person and says what actually happened during that window of time in language that is specific and factual and does not ask the audience to accept feeling as a substitute for fact. That possibility is the most hopeful one. It is also, based on everything I know about the reality television ecosystem and the pressures it places on the people inside it, probably the most difficult one. Because the truth, in this case, requires admitting something in public that has enormous personal and professional consequences. It requires trusting that an audience which has watched you struggle and fail and get back up will extend the same grace to a failure of a more fundamental kind. It requires believing that honesty, even painful honesty, is more survivable than the ongoing weight of a contradiction that the internet refuses to let rest. I believe it is more survivable. I genuinely believe that. I have watched enough public figures navigate moments of significant public exposure to believe that the audience, more often than people expect, has the capacity to forgive what they cannot respect. What they cannot forgive, what history shows they do not forgive, in the end, is the sustained insistence on a version of events that they can demonstrate with their own archive documentation is not entirely true. That is the thing that ends careers and credibility and the particular kind of audience trust that Darcey Silva has spent years building. Let me tell you something about that audience's trust, because I think it is genuinely undervalued in this conversation. Darcey's fan base, at its core, is made up of people who saw themselves in her. People who have chased something they wanted more than they could sensibly justify chasing. People who have made decisions driven by hope rather than evidence, and felt the consequences of that. People who have loved in ways that were not reciprocated and kept going anyway because the dream felt more real than the disappointment. That identification, that specific, personal, emotional recognition is the foundation of everything she has built with her audience. And that audience, the real core of it, is not going to abandon her for having wanted something desperately. They are going to abandon her if they come to believe she asked them to want it with her under false pretenses, because that is the betrayal that hits differently. That is the one that turned support into something more complicated and more lasting, not the drama, not the messiness. The specific feeling of having extended your own hope to someone else's story, and then discovering that the story was, in a meaningful way, not what you were told it was. That is what is actually at stake here. Not a contract, not a brand deal, not a network relationship. The actual trust of the actual people who have shown up for Darcey Silva through multiple painful storylines across multiple years of very public living. The people who defended her when the critics were loudest. The people who sent her messages of support during the hardest moments. The people who bought into the dream with her. Those people are the ones currently waiting for an answer to a question that has not been answered. And I want to end on something that I think is important and that gets lost in the noise of internet drama and slide presentations and share counts. Whatever happened during that window of time, whatever the truth is that sits underneath the contradiction, the analysis identified Darcey Silva is a person. A person who has lived a significant portion of her life in public and who has paid the psychological price that comes with that. which is not a small price, regardless of what anyone outside of it assumes about the trade-offs involved. She is a person who wants what almost everyone wants and has pursued it with more transparency than most people would be capable of sustaining under that level of scrutiny. The story she has been telling about herself, about love, about family, about deserving a happy ending and being willing to fight for it across every obstacle that the universe has placed between her and it, that story is real, even in the parts of it that may not be literally true. The wanting is real. The longing is real. The dream of building something lasting and meaningful is real. None of that disappears because the timeline has questions in it. What disappears, potentially, is the ability to tell that story in public to an audience that trusts it. And that is a loss that is worth taking seriously, not because the internet demands it, but because Darcey Silva has built something over years of painful and often unglamorous public living that is genuinely hard to build. And the only thing that can protect it now is not a strategy or an emotional video or a well-placed silence. The only thing that can protect it now is honesty. The specific, uncomfortable, biology doesn't negotiate, timestamp documented kind of honesty that the 47 slides made unavoidable. The point of no return has been reached. That analysis exists. It has been seen. It has been shared 180,000 times. The questions have been asked in public, with documentation, in a format that is too organized and too independently verified to be dismissed as gossip. And the longer the specific questions go unanswered, or the more the response leans on emotion and grief rather than evidence and explanation, the louder the silence gets. Darcey Silva has survived things that would have permanently ended other people in this franchise. She has come back from relationships that fell apart publicly and painfully. She is rebuilt after business situations that generated real and sustained criticism. She has weathered years of commentary about her appearance, her choices, her taste in men, and her willingness to keep trying in ways that made some people cringe and others admire her deeply. She is, in many ways, one of the most resilient people this franchise has ever produced. But resilience requires honesty as its foundation. You cannot rebuild on a story that the internet has receipts against. You can only rebuild on the truth of what actually happened, offered without performance and without the protective shield of grief as a substitute for explanation. This is the moment. This is the one that cuts closer to the core of who she is and what she has represented to her audience than any of the others. Because this is not about love or business or beauty or the particular roster of men who have moved through her storyline over the years. This is about truth at the most fundamental level, the level that biology enforces whether you like it or not. The level that timestamps document regardless of what you intended. The level that 180,000 shares makes impossible to quietly undo. The truth either holds or it doesn't. The timeline either works or it doesn't. And the audience, patient and organized and armed with 47 slides and a very long memory, is waiting to find out which one it is. We are going to keep watching this. We are going to keep following the receipts wherever they lead. And we are going to bring you every development as it happens because that is what this channel exists to do. We do not do speculation for the sake of drama. We do documentation for the sake of truth. And in a franchise that has always had a complicated relationship with the difference between those two things, someone has to be willing to sit with the discomfort of an unanswered question and not look away from it until an answer arrives. That is us. That is this channel. That is what the Tell All tapes is built for. If you made it to the end of this video, you already know you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel was made for. So do one thing before you leave. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss a drop, and leave a comment below telling me what you think the response is going to look like and whether you believe the timeline holds. The comments on this one are going to be a conversation worth having. I will be in there reading every single one. The tell-all tapes. We go where the receipts go, and we are just getting started.